Kamal. Hear that?
I did.
Okay, we're not doing tea today. We're doing Diet Cokes. We're going to
are.
consume 12 of them because, you know, when I was at the Trump rally, in the warm-up to the Trump rally, we all stood up and sang the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say, can you see? Etc. And I have in front of me a book called Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. And we're going to speak to the author, Kevin Roberts, who is besties with none other than Vice President-elect JD Vance.
This is all about the background to what is called Project 2025, which I'm vaguely aware of, sounds a bit mysterious, but how much is it going to be the foundational text for Donald Trump and his next electoral presidential moment in American history? And the reason you are drinking Diet Coke, Camilla, and we have 11 other cans in the Daily Tea studio, plus quite a lot of Doritos,
yeah,
and a number of Big Macs and filet o fish, I believe, as it's correctly pronounced.
Love how you said that.
Is because the president-elect, this is apparently what he eats every day for dinner.
And our colleague Gareth Davies, over in America, ate like Trump for a week. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's a miracle he survived it.
And he's wondering how Donald Trump survives it, but survive it he does. I am very excited because actually through this podcast we're going to be munching on a Donald Trump dinner, but no sounds on the mics because it can sound a bit ugly, can't it?
It
Chomping.
Can. Welcome to the Daily Tea with a bad case of indigestion with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed. So Camilla, you're just downing your first Coke there. We're going to try and get through as much of this as we can in the next 30 to 40 minutes of your wonderful company.
Can I just say,
yes,
downing 12 Cokes in a day?
Yes.
Like, what do you think your Coke limit is? I mean, in a day.
Half. To be honest, I find a whole can quite hard work.
It's hard, isn't it? It's like those viral videos where people down cans.
Yes, and you have to eat, and then you have to eat crackers. Anyway, all quite mad. But yes, we're going to be speaking to Gareth from America, plus a nutritionist about why what's in front of us on the podcast table today is actually quite bad for you. And it is a wonder that the president looks as well as he does.
Does he look well? He looks a little bit orange.
Maybe just looks as he does. I don't know.
Yeah,
but as you say, you have done a wonderful interview with Kevin Roberts, who is the author of what is actually a significant book, because just like Margaret Thatcher achieved in the 70s with a new text and approach for the right against the left of the 1970s, this book is attempting to do the same thing for the conservative right, the Republican right in America. And Kevin Roberts, who is the overall author of this book, as you say, very close to Vice President-elect JD Vance, who many people think will be a very, very important contender for the next presidential election in 2028. He's written the foreword. So what Kevin Roberts thinks is very important for the trajectory of Republican politics in America for the next 4 to 5 years.
And just to put him into context, do you remember during the election night, I and Louisa, the executive producer, visited a Republican party, and it was at the Heritage Foundation, which is in Washington. They're a bit lesser spotted there because they're Republicans in Washington, D.C. And that is the biggest conservative think tank in America. Jubilant scenes as we went into the night, as it soon became clear that this was going to be an overwhelmingly thumping Trump victory. So basically, Kevin Roberts works for the Heritage, and what the book represents...
He's CEO of it, I think.
He's president. He's president of it.
Of course.
And it's kind of, Project 2025, it's a sort of 900-page wish list. And the central themes are quite conservative, with a small and big C, when you consider politics in this country as well as the US. Restoring the family as a centrepiece of American life, dismantling the administrative state, defending the nation's sovereignty and borders, and securing God-given individual rights to live freely. But this book isn't without controversy. Shall we listen to how Kevin and I, two righties, admittedly, but I think coming from slightly different directions, managed to banter out what he is proposing Trump should do in his second term in office? Kevin Roberts joins me now. He's the president of the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action. Before we get into the details of your new book, Kevin, Dawn's Early Light, I love that. That's very star-spangled, if I may say. Tell us what the heritage is, because I think quite a few people in the UK won't quite know its history and origins.
Your audience no doubt knows what a think tank is. That's what we are at our foundation. But most importantly, we're distinctive about this in the United States, is rather than just write about policy research, we advocate for that. So we have a lobbying team that lobbies Congress and up to 30 state legislatures in our country for good policy. We also kill some bad policy. We are the largest conservative policy organization in the world. And I think we've been able to grow to that size over the last 52 years because we're focused not just on the research, Camilla, but also on doing something about it. Therefore, in Washington, we're sort of call ourselves the people's outpost behind enemy lines.
Oh, hello. Yes, there's lots of sort of warrior talk, actually. Even in JD Vance's preface to your book, sort of talks about, let me just read this out. Never before has a figure with Roberts's depth and stature within the American right tried to articulate a genuinely new future for conservatism. We are now all realizing that it's time to circle the wagons and load the muskets. In the fights that lie ahead, these ideas are an essential weapon. So there's fighting talk here. Is this because in Democrat-leading Washington, you're very much in a minority? Is this why you have to sort of fight your battles, Kevin?
We are, and because the Democrats have done such a terrible job running our public education system, always have to say to them, the left, who have lost both their sense of humor and their understanding of metaphor. These fighting references are metaphorical, they're figurative, but in a political sense, we do fight. We have to fight on behalf of the ordinary American to push out the interests of establishment Washington, and that's what the book's about.
But have you been fighting among yourselves? Now, I refer to Project 2025. It's quite a controversial sort of set of values and ideas, this, because, well, first of all, tell me what Project 2025 is.
I've never heard of it.
Kevin, now. Come now.
It's the most ambitious set of policies and personnel database recommendations that the conservative movement in the United States has ever made. Since 1980, Camilla, the Heritage Foundation has put together what we call Mandate for Leadership, a set of policies. Think of it as sort of a policy menu if you are an incoming conservative presidential administration. Never before, however, have we involved 110 other organizations and also built a conservative personnel platform to which 20,000 Americans have submitted their resumes for consideration by the president and vice president. They make the decisions. We're simply cultivating, curating, if you will, this group of Americans who want to serve not just the presidency, but also a growing number of gubernatorial administrations at the state level. That made it a real target by the left, which couldn't run on its policy record.
Okay, so 4 main central policy aims: restore the family as a centerpiece of American life, dismantle the administrative state, defend the nation's sovereignty and borders, and secure God-given individual rights to live freely. Is this basically a blueprint for Trump 2.0?
If he so chooses, it can be. Ultimately, what we see it as is a blueprint for any president, for that matter, any governor or elected official in the United States, to implement common sense policy to restore the American dream. A really key thing for me to mention is that Heritage works on every policy issue. Project 2025 and its policy recommendations literally covers everything. Never would a politician be able to implement all of that, right? So it really is a matter of the president-elect and the vice president-elect deciding what their priorities are going to be. Where the rubber meets the road is that when they decide on a certain policy, if they want a roadmap or a blueprint for that particular policy, such as dismantling the U.S. Department of Education, our scholars have written that in that book.
Okay, so if there is doing some heavy lifting, right? Because obviously these are just ideas and recommendations. However, I referred to the infighting earlier because there was a point where Trump seemed to reject Project 2025. Back in July, he wrote on his social media platform, Truth Social, "I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. But you're saying they're commonsensical. So who's right and who's wrong here?"
Well, I'd say we're both right. President Trump was right to distance himself from the left's mischaracterization of our work during a campaign season in which he was outspent more than 2-1. The left spent $75 million mischaracterizing our work. We only spent a few $1 million on it. Now that we're in policy-making season, I would say that all of us in the conservative movement are right. We were right that Trump personifies this movement. We are right today that if you want the right people to go into an administration, look to the conservative movement to do that. I think the president-elect has done an A-plus job in selecting his cabinet thus far. Obviously, he makes the decisions. The president's always going to make those determinations. But we thought going into this presidential cycle that it was imperative that the American conservative movement prepare the president, whoever he would be, better than we ever have. And obviously, the combination of President Trump with his expertise, his experience, his instincts, along with those plans, make me very optimistic about the American future.
But do you present something that is a bit more extreme than you think would ever be sort of green-lighted in a beat to just keep the conservative end up? Say, for instance, on abortion, there's no way, and Donald Trump, I think, has said this, and his wife, actually, Melania, has been very vocal about a woman's right to choose and to control her own body. There's no way, for instance, that Trump would advocate a full abortion ban, whereas some, I don't know if that includes yourself, Kevin, would endorse that.
Two things. We don't call in Project 2025 for an abortion ban. We are at the Heritage Foundation aspirational about the American future where there would be no abortions, hopefully from factors that are upstream of politics and policy, individuals in their communities, a matter of their own heart and conscience deciding they don't want to do that. But the second thing is President Trump was right. I talked earlier about the political season. He was right that the American people wanted to be in the center politically on this issue. That's where he ran. It doesn't mean that he's opposed to our motivations for talking about what we talk about in terms of states taking action on abortion. It also means that Project 2025 and President Trump are much more aligned with the American people than Kamala Harris and the radical left were. That's the really key thing to keep in mind as it relates to abortion-making restrictions or abortion restrictions. That is, the Dobbs decision was a huge win for those of us who are pro-lifers. But those of us who are pro-lifers were caught flat-footed as a result of the radical left spending a lot of time on these ballot referenda. Now we've sort of leveled the playing field, and the next generation, to cut to the chase here, Camilla, of work on abortion will really be at the community level, at the individual level. And this is so much more important than politics and policy. I think ultimately that's where the movement needs to focus if we want to have some more success.
But how about some of the suggestions around, for instance, dissolving or disbanding the New York Times, the Bill and Melania Gates Foundation? There's talk about dispensing with the Department for Education. I mean, you're talking about common sense policy. Some people, even if they're not on the left, actually might think, goodness me, that sounds quite extreme.
Oh, gosh, and I think you're tempting me with a good time. I use this metaphor of a controlled burn that is going into a forest with a lot of dead wood. And at least our Forest Service in the United States used to burn that dead wood as a way of regenerating new growth, regenerating the health of trees there. It's one of the reasons we have so many forest fires in the United States is because the government doesn't do much of that anymore. I take that idea of a controlled burn and I apply it metaphorically to institutions and organizations that are rotten to their core. There are good men and women in all of those entities that you mentioned. It's not about them as individuals. But the point is, in the United States, in addition to our political problems, we have institutional rot. We have organizations and institutions and entities that no longer cultivate a spirit of the American dream. They no longer cultivate a spirit of truth. In fact, some of them, like the Gates Foundation, spend billions of dollars advocating against capital T truth.
Although, just the counter-argument to that would be the Bill and it's Melinda, isn't it?
Yes.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done a huge amount, for instance, to try and cure malaria in the developing world.
They have, although the hidden story on that is they often use that as an entree into some of their very nefarious radical policies. I cover that in the book.
Sorry, you were going to continue to make a point. I mean, this idea of I can see where you're coming from. We've got problems in the UK about the kind of influx of woke into our organisations. And I would take it from your suggestions about the Department for Education that you're worried perhaps about gender ideology being taught in school, perhaps even, diversity and other style teachings, which may perhaps teach children that, they need to be feeling guilty for white privilege and all the rest of it. But is that actually a reason to set the whole thing on fire?
No,
I mean, that sounds quite destructive rather than We want solutions to some of these problems, don't we? We don't need a sort of wholesale burning to the ground of all of the institutions that quite a lot of people respect as a whole.
Let's take the Department of Education itself. The reason to dismantle it, which President Trump has said he's going to do, isn't just because of its infatuation with woke ideology. It's because its core function, which is the education of America's school children, has been an abject failure at. Since 1979, when it was created by the National Assessment of Education Statistics, objective, neither liberal nor conservative annual survey of 4th, 8th, and 11th graders in the United States, educational attainment has decreased among every single demographic group in the country. The U.S. Department of Education is the best funded and most failing education entity in the developed world. It's on those grounds that we believe it needs to be dismantled. And also for parents listening to that, or just the average citizen listening to that saying, well, what happens to education? We actually improve education by returning that money to the states and allowing the states, as we understand in our federalist system in the United States, to be so-called laboratories of democracy. That's actually a much more aspirational vision than the mediocrity on its best day that the U.S. Department of Education has implemented.
Okay, so that's a good example, but there are sometimes contradictions at the heart of the right's project. For instance, the right tend to be, and I'm among the right, I count myself as a righty, we tend to be very vocal, for instance, on freedom of speech. And yet talk about dissolving, for instance, the New York Times seems to be leaning into this idea that you yourselves want to cancel people that you disagree with. There's a big dialogue going on at the moment about the right and social media. Oh, well, it's okay for Elon Musk to be supporting Trump because I agree with Elon Musk, but I didn't agree with Jack Dorsey. Therefore, we want to try and attempt to bring him down. Do you see? That's a contradiction, isn't it? We need all voices to be heard here, even if it's the New York Times or the Washington Post that you might not agree with the editorial of.
Very important caveat or explanation is needed, however. I'm not arguing in my book that the federal government in the New York Times. I'm arguing that individuals stop giving them money through subscriptions and ads because they're a bunch of liars.
Yeah, but that's
and so I'm
their
relying
choice.
on the market.
It's capitalism, isn't it?
It's also my choice in the book to encourage people to take action that actually benefits America, and that is one.
But you can't be on the right and then try and close down people's freedom of choice. If people want to consume the rhetoric of the New York Times in the same way that they want to gobble down everything that's written in The Guardian, they're perfectly entitled to do so.
Oh, it's certainly their right, but it's also my right to encourage them not to do so because it's a waste of their time and it's a bunch of lies.
All right. So how about the other contradiction, which when I looked at what you were saying about the value of family, I thought, well, hang on a minute. You're on the religious right. You've said you're I'm assuming so because you've said you're a pro-lifer.
So therefore, I'm the religious right?
Well, am I mischaracterizing you? Please do correct me.
I'm a conservative. I don't put any modifier in front of it.
Okay. So let's take the religious out of it, but you're certainly on the kind of family-orientated, hopefully morally
I'm a husband and father of 4, so I am family-oriented.
I'm a wife and father of 3. I'm a wife and mother of 3.
Now there is a story.
Now there's a story. So you're on the side of, I suppose, what you would regard to be kind of morally upright people who believe in family, who presumably believe in marriage, who don't believe in abortion. And yet Donald Trump comes along, who is somebody that not everybody would agree fits that kind of mold of somebody who is morally upstanding, believes in family, believes in faithfulness, perhaps, if we could say that in a marital sense. Isn't there a contradiction there as well?
If we were voting to elect a pastor of the United States, we're voting to elect a president of the United States. But I'm not trying to be too cute with that response. I do mean that, but I'll make a second point because your question is very fair. We believe that all leaders should be virtuous, and all of us are fallen by human nature. Perhaps the perception is that some men and women are more fallen than others. That's up to the voters to decide. But I will also say that this American, 200 years after the famous Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, traveled the United States, will lean on his observations then because they're applicable now. And that is, if you're concerned, he would, to paraphrase him, Americans, about the virtue of your leaders, look in the mirror. And so our leaders, for better, for worse, for in between, are reflections of us. And if therefore we have an issue with a particular leader or another, maybe we ought to be spending more time regenerating the institutions like the family that help cultivate these values from one generation to the next. Ultimately, Camilla, this is the longest term of long-term objectives that I set out in the book, and that's also regenerating our culture, not around liberal or conservative. That's sort of the least of my worries, around common sense about what's true, but also a real appreciation for the dignity of each human person. It's important that our leaders reflect that too.
I know you're close friends with the Vice President-elect, JD Vance. And obviously he's been on his own journey when it comes to Trump, once a never Trumper and now Trump's right-hand man, so to speak. Would it be accurate, perhaps, Kevin, to describe you more kind of Vancian than Trumpian? I mean, just with regard to his backstory, I think the pick by Trump of Vance was genius. It's intellectualized his campaign. I think Vance has that unique appeal to middle America. I think his backstory is compelling. He isn't sort of got the millionaire baggage that Trump has got. And clearly he can articulate an argument. Is it the case, perhaps, and he's family orientated, and I suppose is an easier fit into that kind of morally upstanding vision of what an American president should be? So has his election or his proposed election to be vice president made it easier for somebody like you or some people on the right to support the Republicans as they stand at the moment?
Great question. I was, speaking for myself, fully supportive of President Trump before his selection of JD Vance. To your point, however, his selection of Vance did convince a lot of Americans, and a lot of them not conservatives. Americans in the political center, maybe even a little bit on the center left, to say, and these are people who, for whatever reason, have issues with Trump. Personality-wise, maybe they perceive him as having a life that's not befitting being president. I disagree with that, but respect their opinion. And the selection of Vance, and we know this objectively, actually brought them home to the Trump-Vance campaign. I will say for myself, my wife and family, that what we love about Vance is that he is the perfect complement to Trump. And we love Trump too. And I think about it this way. Trump is in his late 70s. Vance just turned 40. I'm a Generation Xer. I'm 50. And so I feel like I've got a foot in both worlds. My parents' generation, which is Trump's. Vance obviously is older than our own kids, but he definitely reflects that younger generation of conservatives in the United States. And interestingly, the only generation in the United States of which a majority of people voted for President Trump was Generation X. And I think it's because we understand that we have to honor the past, which Trump is doing, and we also have to build a bridge to the future. Vance is considered kind of heterodox in some conservative circles because he's willing to talk about family policy. He's willing to talk about using the federal government in ways that when I was younger, conservatives never discussed. He may be right or wrong about those things, but what he's really right about is that we ought to have the conversation rather than disallowing it. And that's refreshing to a lot of Americans.
We had this debate when Boris Johnson was elected with a landslide victory in 2019, how much it was reflective of the popularity of Boris Johnson, not least in his pledge to get Brexit done, and how much it was actually a victory for the right. And I think we can perhaps apply the same thinking to Trump's second victory, right? How much is this about Trump, the businessman, the former apprentice star, and people's confidence in him turning the economy around? And how much is it being taken by the right as a victory for so-called right-minded thinking? What do you think? Because obviously there's this, we haven't quite got the final figure of the popular vote, but Trump has done astonishingly well. He's done as well as, I think, George W. Bush in 2004. And we know why his vote surged, not least because of his handling of what had happened during 9/11. So is this suddenly indicative that the tide is turning, that people are more right-wing than everyone's given them credit for in America?
I'm not sure that I would use the description right-wing to describe it. I would say at the very least that a majority of Americans have said, we want to return to a normal country. We want to return to common sense. And so if you take those of us at Heritage who are unabashedly conservative, who are with Trump because of his expertise, his experience in his first term as a conservative president, and then you combine that in the same coalition with someone like RFK Jr., who's not a conservative. He's very thoughtful, I'd say center-left, old-school liberal, like I grew up with, and you put those in the same coalition and everyone in between, like Tulsi Gabbard, what unites all of us, in addition to our love for this country, our respect for Trump sacrificing so much, ultimately almost paying the ultimate sacrifice, is that desire for normalcy. And that's what we keep hearing in the States at Heritage as we do our work. The interesting point, and you imply this in your question, is where does this go from here? And I think that hinges on the ability of the Trump-Vance administration to implement the policies they promised they would do, and also be very good at messaging. They've got to constantly be closing the sale with this coalition, because on any given day, whether it's the life issue for people like me, or maybe a government spending issue for people in the political center, it's a bit of a tightrope act. And how you do that on a day-to-day basis is a challenge in D.C. But our interests at Heritage are, how do you turn that into a long-term coalition that's reflective of this realignment? I'm optimistic about that happening, and I lay that out in the book, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy.
On RFK, you're comfortable with him being in charge of health policy in America?
It's a glorious, glorious selection.
Even though he's an anti-vaxxer?
Especially because he's an anti-vaxxer.
I mean, I listened to that as a so-called righty, as a mother of children and the daughter of a retired GP. I'm very pro-vaccination, not least when it comes to warding off measles, chickenpox, polio and other nasties. And you're quite happy with RFK being in that role?
Up to this point, I thought you were so perfect. Yes, I'm very comfortable with him in that role. The difference of opinion that Mr. Kennedy and I have is on abortion. And that in the weeks and months coming down the road, because the Department of Health and Human Services, which he oversees, has a lot of policies that will cause someone to be on one side or the issue of that side of that issue. That's going to be the real telltale. But on the matter of vaccinations, particularly as it relates to the COVID vaccine, and it shouldn't be called that, I think he's 100% right.
What about childhood vaccinations?
I think some of those are fine, but I think this regime that has been established, at least in the United States, I can speak to more authoritatively, in which big pharma has colluded with big government to disallow free speech on some of the very good scientific studies that call into question some of these vaccines. At the very least, we ought to be having those conversations rather than disallowing them.
I mean, wasn't it just politics, though? RFK agrees to support Trump because Trump's made a promise to him that he'll get the health brief.
No, it's much more substantive than that.
Okay. Talking of other individuals that have been supportive of Project 2025, I note that quite a few of them are filling up Trump's cabinet already. Got Brendan Carr, who's Trump's nominee to be chair of the Federal Communications Commission. He authored Project 2025's chapter on the agency, which regulates TV, radio, the internet and comms. We've got Trump's border czar, Tom Homan. He has also been involved in Project 2025. John Ratcliffe, another figure. He's a former director of national intelligence, nominated as the next CIA director. So actually, you've got quite a few tentacles now into the White House. So does that mean that we can see more, not less, of some of the aims and ambitions of Project 2025?
You'd think so, because as President Reagan said, people are policy. Personnel is policy. That's our mantra at Heritage. Ultimately, Trump and Vance will determine that. Heritage is not going to determine that, to be clear. But the real reason that someone would anticipate that is because there is such dramatic overlap in President Trump's articulated campaign agenda, Agenda 47, mandate for leadership, the policy part of Project 2025, but perhaps most importantly, to the overriding point, the people. We've had a few hundred people associated with Project 2025 as lead policy authors who worked in the first Trump administration. And they're likely to be asked back because of who they are, like those you mentioned.
Final question. Is JD Vance the next US president after Trump, do you think?
It certainly looks that way. But having said that, and JD knows, Vice President-elect Vance knows I don't intend this as any slight, we have a very deep bench on the political right. I think Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is the most successful governor period in the last 50 years in the United States. He's still a young man. We have other members of the Senate, in addition to now Senator Vance, who are very promising men and women. And so there will be a primary in 2028, no doubt. President Trump can't run again. But I do think that JD Vance, particularly if this administration does well, is in a leading role. I think he personifies where this realignment is going. Ultimately, Heritage and I have to be agnostic because of our tax status, but at least fellow traveler to fellow traveler with similar upbringings, which I talk about in the book, I have a lot of respect for him.
Kevin Roberts, thank you very much indeed for appearing on the Daily T to discuss Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America.
You're very kind. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
That, Camilla, was a fascinating chat. Interesting, as you say, you were coming from slightly different perspectives. And the UK right is always going to be very different from the US right. One big reason for that is that the US economy is driven inside, in the majority of cases, inside the US, whereas the UK really does rely on trade with the rest of the world. We're quite a small economy, so some of the things don't translate into the UK from America. Great line from him. Democrats have lost their sense of humour. Isn't that true of Labour here, and generally the left has lost not just its sense of humour, but its aspirational edge. And I think that was a really important point.
Just going to open these Doritos if you don't.
We keep eating. We've got to keep eating all the way through. We were eating throughout that interview, and we're just struggling through the 2 Big Macs, 2 filet-o-fishers, small chocolate milkshake, Doritos, and we're still 11 cans of Coke.
Chocolate milkshake
Apparently,
these days.
Lillian, one of our producers, who has very brilliantly gone out to buy that, says that's a small one. It looks quite big to me.
Grief.
I thought the other thing which was interesting was tackling corporate America. He raised Apple and Google. And I've been talking quite a long time about how these tech giants have really changed the way the economy operates. I'm getting some chewing in my ear from you, Camilla. So
Sorry,
that's hopefully that's no.
This is what is needed.
I know.
We're being paid for this. We're being paid for this.
I know. Very important. But I've been writing for a while and thinking for a while. Productivity problem. These massive global tech companies, which are often more powerful than governments. It's called monopsony, not quite monopolies, but close to monopolies in different areas. The fact that the right is starting to take on what does that mean for productivity, for people's jobs, for jobs in communities, I think is a really interesting trend, which is really vital and important. He compared Apple and Google to the British East India Company, a sort of private and public operator, almost like a quasi-government. You couldn't do anything without Apple's permission or Google's permission. But you made a very good point. Didn't quite get there with X, did he, and Elon Musk.
No.
And Elon Musk.
My problem with the whole offering is that it's extremely blokey. And we have just, I say we, MPs and members have just elected a female leader of the Conservative Party in this country, in Kemi Badenoch. And when he was speaking, I sort of thought, well, hang on, where's the offering for the right-minded, in both senses of the word, conservative woman here? You're sort of trying to push against abortion in the most extreme manner, really. I know he said he wasn't there for an all-out ban, and neither is Trump, but it's very much telling women what to do with their bodies, which I think is anathema to most women, whether they're on the left or the right. You've then got RFK appointed to this health role where most mothers of children will be saying to themselves, hang on a minute, I'm not really sure I want somebody overseeing childhood vaccinations who doesn't actually believe in their efficacy. You know, I'm all for vaccinating children and preventing them from having fatal diseases. Also, Trump himself, I mean, there is that contradiction at the heart of his fan base, who are all meant to be family orientated and morally upstanding. And then we're meant to be advocating this bloke who's suggested it's okay to grab women by the, you know, the word and all the rest of it, and probably hasn't had the most loyal relationship to Melania that he could have, etc., etc. So that troubles me. Having said that, I do sympathise with the railing against wokery, and I do sympathise with this idea that Democrats and institutions have forced upon their people policies and doctrines that they don't actually believe in which the silent majority looks at, scratches their heads and says, what's all this about? This is complete nonsense. There's been a prioritisation of things that don't matter over things that do, and that is why Trump has been victorious. And actually, Kevin was a thoroughly decent man. You know, I think there's also something to be said for Vance's approach. I think there's something to be said as well for Vance. Vance is the more acceptable face of republicanism, even though he himself has been quite controversial, on the basis that he isn't Trump, and he's actually far more intellectual, and he's willing to go on the airwaves and make the arguments for conservatism. This is one of the criticisms that were made of Harris. She didn't open herself up to scrutiny. She didn't debate the arguments on the Democratic left. She just used all of her interviews as an excuse to attack Trump. We've had this whole conversation in recent years, what is the right? What does it mean? What are conservative values? Actually, I think we're now asking that of the left. We're asking it in this country. Sorry, you got elected on this platform. You're now doing something completely different. What is it that you stand for?
If you were to ask Keir Starmer, what is the equivalent of Dawn's Early Light? What is the equivalent document that people can look to and say, oh, okay, I sort of understand where Labour is going. I may agree or disagree. I think he would struggle to tell you what that is. What you're also seeing in a book like this and in people like Kevin Roberts and particularly in JD Vance is a succession. There is already an idea on the right in America that JD Vance is the coming person. Just turned 40. Donald Trump, of course, is 78. He's not going to be able to stand again in any case, whatever his age was, because he's done 2 terms. JD Vance, in his introduction to the book, talks about protectionism, and you touched on this in your interview. And today's news from America, or the overnight news for America, and JD Vance says in the introduction, protectionism, tariffs is good, even if it means prices rise in the short term. That's an interesting point that JD Vance makes, because if you do put in tariffs, it does put up goods inside your country. Trump overnight has announced that he wants to do these tariffs from the very beginning of his presidency. That will be tariffs on the 2 biggest trading partners for America, that's Canada and Mexico, which he said he wants to increase by 25% or have 25% tariffs, undermining a free trade agreement that they signed in his last presidency, and also additional 10% of tariffs on China. But they've made an argument that this is all about supporting manufacturing in America, localized jobs, communities, and that, as JD Vance says, inflation, price rises, is a price worth paying. So that is an argument they have made. Kevin Roberts also talks about, hasn't Trump been perfect in his first set of nominations for his cabinet? Well, Matt Gaetz, his pick for Attorney General, has already quit that process because of the controversy over allegations of him having sex with a minor, allegations that he denies. RFK, Camilla, I mean, this kind of, not just vaccination skeptical, but anti-vax. We had a health expert on the podcast last week who said this will lead to deaths. It's that simple. So my worry is
lead to tooth decay.
My worry is with people like Kevin Roberts, who is making this argument that don't take everything Trump says literally. Some of it is metaphorical. And when he talked about dissolving the New York Times and dissolving the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he doesn't mean it literally, but he means they should be kind of cleared out of the way, or the arguments should be made against them. It's going down to this, what I think is quite a dangerous trend in politics, which is fan-based politics, i.e. Kevin Roberts thinks that Trump can do no wrong. Even when the evidence is staring him in the face. Matt Gaetz was not appropriate to be Attorney General, which is why he's quit the race. RFK is a vaccine denier, which health experts say in America, and the evidence will be there, will lead to the deaths of particularly young people who are not vaccinated against things like measles. But because Kevin Roberts is a fan, like you might be a fan of a baseball team, your team can do no wrong. I think that's the one area where there's a danger, where the thoughtful right of Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, there is thoughtful right here, but that is the danger point.
Quick thought before we shove all of these remaining burgers down our necks. We were talking in the leaders' meeting earlier, and that's the meeting where we discuss letters, comment pieces in the paper, and indeed the leaders' column. And it was talking about worklessness and this drive that Starmer has got to get people off benefits and back into the office and workplace. And the conclusion was drawn that we needed a revolution. There's this sense, isn't there, that the status quo isn't working. The so-called global elites have had it their way for too long. Kamal, nobody's growing, nobody's progressing except China, and it's all gone very badly wrong. So the counter narrative, I guess, is you appoint all of these quite controversial people. You do things like the tariff announcement, which people go, oh my goodness, shock, horror, the markets. You absolutely go in there, tear up the whole order and change things. It's a huge experiment. It could backfire in everyone's faces. This is what Liz Truss tried to do and failed within 49 days. Let's just see if Trump 2.0 does change things for the better, then at least we might have an alternative narrative to everything staying the same and people still expecting things to change.
It's definitely a 1979, 1980 moment, which is Thatcher-Reagan. You have a situation here where you have Trump. You don't have, obviously, a similar leader to Thatcher here in the UK, but Trump is going to go in and test these ideas. And I think, in a way, as you say, given the run we've had since the financial crisis of very low productivity, a lack of growth, a lack of real incomes increasing for people, I think it's an experiment worth trying. My hope is that they know what to drop and they know what to do. And actually, Trump 2016 to 2020 did far less than what he said he was going to do pre-2016, because he said he was going to get rid of the Department of Education. Last time around, it never happened. Reagan said he was going to get rid of the Department of Education in the 1980s. It never happened. In the end, reality can bite, but let's hope that they can at least be aggressive on some of these really big issues, like the role of big tech.
From experimental politics to experimental journalism. Because we have got a huge amount of food in front of us. We have got Trump's dinner in a day, which is actually just eye-wateringly horrendous on site, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I've never seen such an unhealthy spread, except perhaps observing my 14-year-old son eat after a football match. But sticking with the Trump theme, we're going to be speaking to the colleague who ate like the Donald for a week and lived to tell the tale.
See that continuity there, Camilla? We had a Diet Coke can at the beginning.
So gas-inducing.
Diet
It's
Coke can
horrific.
after the break. Welcome back, everybody. And now, for me, quite an exciting day. It's almost like Christmas here in the podcast studio, because we have literally laid out before us, apparently, what Donald Trump likes to eat at dinner. He doesn't eat anything during the day apart from maybe the odd Dorito. He does drink 12 cans of Diet Coke, apparently, but we have 2 Big Macs. We have 2 filet-o-fish, and we have what's supposed to be a small chocolate milkshake, but we think it might be a big one. And we've only got 1 straw, so I don't think we're going to share that. You can have that, Camilla. You can have that on your own.
Are you a chocolate
in case you've got any
man?
diseases you don't want to hand on to me?
No, well, I hope not. Not that I know of.
Now, we are joined from Washington, a very dapper-looking Gareth Davies. Now, Gareth, you, for the good of journalism, and you must be a proud man, and if you don't win an award for this, there is no justice. Gareth Davies is joining us from America to talk about your week eating like Donald Trump. And we also have joining us, I think from Bristol, slightly less far away, is the Telegraph nutritionist Sam Rice. Hello, Gareth, and hello, Sam. Thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea. Now, Gareth, we're going to come to you first just to talk us through. Anyone who is listening to this and watching this, please do go to the Telegraph website or app. Look for Gareth Davies's piece. It is one of the funniest and shocking pieces of writing we've had in the Telegraph for many months. And Sam, your attempts to pick out the tiny glimmers of maybe hope that you might get a tiny fleck of fiber from a Dorito is a joy to see. You always like to be on the slightly positive side. But look, Gareth, tell us about the project that you went through.
Yeah, I mean, it came from a brainstorm out here in Washington when RFK described Donald Trump's diet as poison. So we sort of tried to get an idea of what it might be. So I went through old cuts and figured out what it was that he ate. And basically for breakfast, it was either bacon and eggs, or usually nothing. For lunch, it was a meatloaf sandwich, or again, usually nothing. And then, it was a selection of fast food for tea. So either the McDonald's that you guys have got there, or a KFC bucket, or a pizza, or a steak, which was well done with just ketchup on the side. So, and then during the day, as you said, there's no water involved, there's no coffee, there's no tea. So it's just Diet Cokes and the odd Dorito. So initially I was quite excited about it. I mean,
I would be.
eat all that for a week and do it guilt-free. Great. But it didn't take very long for me to realize I'd made a horrible mistake.
Gareth, did you actually plough through 12 Diet Cokes a day? Because it's hard getting one down.
It really is. So on day one, I only got through 3. And then the best, I gradually increased.
Sorry,
it.
Gareth. Camilla's just unwrapping a Big Mac here as you speak, but carry on.
And do you know what? It's a fillet of fish. I don't think I've ever had one.
No, I didn't.
Let's have a
until
try of
this
this.
week.
My God, it's got fluorescent cheese in it. Sorry.
Gareth, carry on. Gareth, as Camilla munches away here.
Yeah, so I did 3. I did 3 on day one, and I managed to get up to 9 on the last day. But that, I'm a big coffee drinker. I'll have sort of 2 or 3 before 9 o'clock usually. So having to substitute Diet Coke for my morning coffee was bleak. But the worst thing was, obviously, eating this really salty diet. Usually I'd have a glass of water by the side of the bed for when I wake up at 2 a.m. with a dry mouth. That was off the menu. So I had to go to bed with a can of Diet Coke by my bedside. And if I woke up in the middle of the night, that was the only thing to pull me out of dehydration, which, as you can imagine, probably wasn't the best.
Now, Sam, there is a serious point underlining all this. As RFK said, he considers this type of ultra-processed food as poisonous. Sam, can you just take us through some of the risks on relying on a diet of Big Macs?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having to wash down the fillet of fish with the chocolate milkshake because that is truly awful.
Yeah, that's not a good combination.
Sam, just talk us through the risks here that are in front of us.
Yeah.
Are we going to get through this podcast and not actually expire?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard enough looking at it, let alone eating it. So my heart goes out to Gareth on this one. But as you say, there is a serious point here in that although not necessarily toxic or poisonous, this diet, I mean, Donald Trump is 78. He's managed to survive this far on eating a fairly horrendous diet. But of course, you could not describe this as in any way a healthy, balanced diet. It is extremely meat-based. It is full of ultra-processed foods, which we know are not good for our long-term health, and our risk of all sorts of chronic diseases increase. There's a lot of processed meat, which we also know has been linked to a higher risk of colorectal cancer. There's very little fibre. So, I mean, God knows what your guts were like, Gareth, by the end of this week, but you must have been experiencing bloating. You must have been having some kind of problems in the toilet department, I would have thought. So short-term and long-term risks here. And the glaringly obvious thing to me is the complete lack of fruit and vegetables and water. I mean, these are fundamental parts of a good diet. And so I would say that although Trump has somehow got away with us, I think he is definitely at a higher risk of all sorts of things like heart disease, stroke, possibly dementia risk increase with this kind of diet. So, it seems to me, I suppose, he's not doing well on the diet. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink, as far as I know, he doesn't take drugs. So he's doing quite well on all the other pillars of wellness, you could say. But certainly on diet, he is failing pretty badly.
Now, Gareth, we certainly don't want you going into the detail of what happened in the toilet department, not least because some people listen to the Daily Tea while they're cooking their evening meal.
And we are literally eating, Camilla. Although, Gareth, everyone do read Gareth's article, because the last couple of paragraphs are quite wincing, Gareth, about your toilet habits during this diet. But anyway, yes.
Sam, you've said about a lack of fruit and veg. I've just found a gherkin in this Big Mac,
which
has got a generous amount of lettuce in it. I suppose you could say that this chocolate milkshake has at least got some calcium in it. And indeed, the filet fish. I mean, we're all meant to be eating fish, apparently. It's very good for us, isn't it, Sam?
We are. I'm not sure sort of highly processed McDonald's style fish is what we're really after. I mean, there's no oily fish in this diet at all, which you need for the omega-3 brain health side of things. And I think I'm right in saying his father died at aged 88 from dementia. So he's got that in his DNA. And, he could do well to take that a bit more seriously. I mean, some might say the cognitive decline has already set in, but I think, if he doesn't take that seriously, it could be a problem for him, in his next term. Some of the things he's saying are sort of quite suspect already. So let's see how that pans out.
Gareth, how did it make you feel, both physically, but also sort of mentally, and your cognitive ability, as Sam says?
Yeah, it was physically, it was really quite grim. Obviously, he plays golf. I was keen to carry on exercising as I was. And I just found that I had no energy at all during the week. I was jumping on the Peloton, and usually I get through about sort of, 10 and a half miles to 11 miles in a 30 minute session, sorry. And I was only getting sort of 8.5. And weirdly, when I was on it, usually within 5 minutes, I am dripping in sweat. But this week, the last week, it felt like my body was just trying to cling on to any water it had in its body and in my body, and it just wasn't allowing me to sweat. And when I did, it was really syrupy, if that makes sense. It was pretty grim. And yeah, just the energy levels generally throughout the days were pretty low. I slept really well, which is quite strange, possibly because Donald Trump has said to take melatonin before bed, which helps you sleep. So that helped. But yeah, generally it was just a very low energy week. And the worst thing was I've been playing rugby out here, and I had a half decent season, and I got invited to train with the Capital Selects, which is a sort of representation team of the Atlantic Division of the US. So I had that on Saturday, and I was just an absolute shambles because I'd been eating like a drain all week. I hadn't had any water. So I set my alarm for midnight, glugged as much water as I could to try and rehydrate myself. And one of the first things we did on the Saturday was a fitness test, and I had to slide off to the toilet, and I was just sick everywhere.
Oh, no.
So it wasn't the best preparation for a 4.5 hour sort of training camp day. But there we go.
Sam, Gareth actually lost 6 pounds at the end of this exercise, which is weird and unexpected. But why do you think that might be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was quite a short experiment of 5 days. So any weight loss over that period is going to be very limited, particularly since his calorie intake was still quite high. So I don't think we can say that he's lost fat here, but he has definitely become extremely dehydrated, as he's illustrated there. And, possibly if he was drinking the 12 cans of Diet Coke a day, that would be fluid intake at least, but it's also a diuretic. And so I think he just became extremely dehydrated, and you can lose up to 10 pounds through dehydration in a short period of time. So I think that's the likely explanation for this.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Gareth, we need a little diet campaign for you. We should call it Make Gareth Great Again. On the rugby field, we need you to be consuming high protein goods, yogurts, cottage cheese, lean meats, lots of greens, fruit and veg. We need to get the Davies back to his...
We do. Get the broccoli in there,
Welsh prime.
Gareth, so you can get back on that rugby pitch and be as brilliant as ever. Thank you for taking almost literally a hit for the team and for the good of journalism.
Thank you.
I'm not actually minding this Big Mac too much.
Mind
Can
a
I
Big Mac,
confess? Can
Camilla?
I confess that?
I don't mind a
Quite
Big Mac. And
enjoying
you've been
it.
tucking into those cool original Doritos like nobody's business, which is absolutely brilliant. So
Look at the traffic lights on these bad boys.
Well,
To
green
be
and yellow,
fair,
not bad. They're not bad.
Sugars are in the green, but fat is in the red.
I think Sam's point was the only thing I'll take of joy from this is that a Big Mac a month, I think she said, which I think is I don't quite have that many, actually, to be honest. I have one every now and again.
Do you know what? You
when I
once
feel
went
like I could
behind
treat.
my back to have one. Do you remember that?
I did.
It
That's
was
nice.
like, where
You
have
do
you
feel
been?
guilty pleasure. I know. You slightly
were like-
hide in Victoria Station, which is just underneath our offices here in central London. And I sometimes go to the Big Mac, but I go to the one upstairs so that I won't
so that
accidentally
I
bump
won't
into
spot
any.
you.
That you won't spot me.
Well, indeed.
We are going to continue enjoying, in inverted commas, we now have 10 cans of Coke left to get through.
Yep.
At least 2 halves of fillet of fish and quite a lot of Big Macs each and Doritos and at least half of a chocolate milkshake. So we're going to get on with those and finish them. But you don't have to stay with us for all of that because we'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m.